We tell ourselves Viking stories about warriors and explorers. Almost nobody talks about the parts that don't fit the heroic story. The slave markets in Dublin and Hedeby, the iron collars, the mass graves. We hear about the longships, but not the human cargo they carried. Chronicles and Bones tell a different story, a story of violence that was systematic, profitable, and directed with cold purpose at the women of the villages they broke. It was a story not just of raiding, but of a brutal trade in mothers and daughters. This script is researched and factual, using sources like the Annals of Ulster and archaeological findings from Viking settlements. Let's talk about what really happened. If you value documented history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. Now back to the story. The first step was the raid. It was fast, and it was total. Imagine the coast of 9th century Ireland. Small communities, farms, and monasteries cling to the shoreline. Life is governed by the seasons and the tides. There is no central army, no early warning system. There's only the sea, and one day the sea brings terror. This terror has a name, Strandhook, the shore hue. It isn't a battle, it's a harvest. The year is 821. The place is Howth, a small settlement on the Irish coast, a finger of land pointing into the sea near modern-day Dublin. For the mothers and daughters there, it is a day like any other. They are mending nets, grinding grain, watching their children play on the shore. Then the dragon ships appear on the horizon. Low in the water, a single sail, a line of shields along the gunwale. They move with terrifying speed. By the time the alarm is raised, it's too late. The raiders hit the beach, screaming, brandishing axes and swords. The men of the village who try to fight back are cut down. The rest are driven off. The raiders ignore the old and the infirm. They are not here for a prolonged fight. They are here for portable wealth. And the most valuable portable wealth is human. The Annals of Ulster, a real chronicle written by Irish monks who witnessed these attacks, records what happened next in Howth. It says the Vikings plundered the village and carried off a great number of women into captivity. There's no ambiguity. They didn't just take gold chalices from the local church. They took people. These women weren't collateral damage. They were the target, the primary objective. A young Norseman trying to build a farmstead and a family back home in a harsh land needed resources. A strong female slave was a critical piece of wealth, a prize to be taken by force, an engine of labor and a means of producing more labor. She was worth more than silver. She was the foundation of a new life, built on the ruin of hers. This wasn't an isolated event. It was a strategy. Decades earlier, in 793, the raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne in England sent a shockwave across Europe. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle laments the fiery dragons and heathen men who lamentably destroyed God's church, but they also took prisoners. 2 years later, they hit Iona in Scotland, then again in 806, leaving 68 monks dead. In every raid, alongside the plundered gold and livestock, people were taken. The sagas, written centuries later, romanticize the warrior, but the chronicles, written at the time, count the human cost. Women were separated from their children on the beach, their husbands killed in front of them. Their homes set ablaze. They were bound and dragged onto the longships, the screams of their families fading as the coast disappeared from view. Their old life was over, reduced to smoke and memory. A new, terrifying one was just beginning. The second step was the market. The journey was an ordeal in itself. A captured woman would be crammed into the open hull of a longship with dozens of others, exposed to the brutal North Atlantic weather for days or weeks. There was little food or water. Sickness was rampant. This was the first filter. Only the strong survived the passage. Those who did were destined for the burgeoning slave-trading hubs of the Viking world. One of the biggest was Viking Dublin, or Dyflin as they called it. By the mid-9th century, it was one of the largest slave markets in Western Europe. Imagine being marched in a line through the muddy streets of the settlement, your hands bound, your spirit broken. Archaeologists in Dublin, digging through the layers of the past at places like Fishamble Street, have unearthed the physical proof of this trade. They found iron collars and chains, simple, brutal tools for controlling human beings. Some are sized for adults, others for children. These weren't for animals. They were for the women and girls taken from places like Howth. In the slave markets, a mother could be sold one way, her daughter another. A girl's value was assessed based on her health, her age, her perceived strength, and what slavers called her beauty. Her teeth would be checked, her limbs inspected. She would be forced to walk, to turn, to prove she was a sound investment. The price fluctuated with supply and demand. After a successful raiding season, the market would be flooded, and prices would drop. In lean years, a single healthy female thrall could be worth a significant weight in silver. The silver dirhams, coins from the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, found in hoards all across Scandinavia, are the receipts of this international trade. The Vikings were the middlemen, capturing people in the west and selling them east along the great river routes of Russia. The 10th century Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan saw these markets on the Volga River firsthand. He was an envoy from the Caliph of Baghdad, a man from a highly sophisticated literate society, and he was utterly shocked by the Rus merchants he encountered. He described them as perfect physical specimens, but their hygiene and behavior horrified him. He wrote of how the merchants would openly have sexual intercourse with the slave girls they were about to sell, right in front of potential buyers, without any sense of shame. He noted, "Of the sale is accomplished in this way. This was business, a cold, calculated transaction where a human life was stripped of all dignity and reduced to a commodity. From Dublin to Hedeby in Denmark, from Birka in Sweden to the bustling ports on the Volga, the fate was the same. A woman's life was no longer her own. It now had a price. The third step was a life of servitude. Once sold, a woman became a thrall, the Norse word for a slave. Her legal status was zero. She was property, like livestock. In the rigid social structure of the Viking Age, you were born into one of three classes: the jarls, the wealthy aristocrats, the carls, the free farmers and merchants who made up the bulk of the population, and the thralls at the very bottom. There was almost no social mobility. If you were a thrall, you stayed a thrall. Her new life was in a longhouse, a long, smoky, crowded building she shared with the master's entire family, and sometimes even their animals. She would sleep on a dirt floor or a simple wooden platform, often near the livestock for warmth. Privacy did not exist. Her days were filled with back-breaking labor. Before dawn, she would be up, stoking the central fire. Her main task was grinding grain. For hours every day, she would kneel at a heavy cornstone, a rotary hand mill, turning the top stone to produce the flour for the day's bread. The repetitive strain was immense. Skeletal remains of women from this period often show severe arthritis in the knees, spine, and shoulders, a direct result of this grueling work. She would also be responsible for weaving on a large, vertical, warp-weighted loom, producing the woolen cloth for the family's clothing. She cooked the meals, gutted the fish, milked the cows, cleaned the longhouse, and served her master's family. Her work never ended. Later, Scandinavian laws, like the Norwegian Gulating law, codify the status of a thrall. The law codes treated maiming or killing a slave as property damage. If a free man killed another man's thrall, he paid a fine to the owner, not as a penalty for taking a human life, but as compensation for lost property, the same way he would pay for killing a cow. Violence was a constant reality. Skeletal remains from Viking era. Norway tell a story of incredible brutality. One female skull from Ringsaker shows a massive blunt force injury, a semicircular depression from a blow that killed her. Nearly 40% of the skeletons examined in one study of remains from this period showed evidence of a violent death. As a thrall, a woman's body was not her own. She was subject to the whims of her owner. The sagas, while often romanticized, are filled with casual depictions of the abuse of thralls. Beatings were common, and sexual assault was not a crime. It was considered an owner's right. The thrall was given a new name, often something simple or derogatory, severing the last link to her home, her family, her identity. She was meant to forget she was ever anything other than a slave. If you value this kind of deep historical storytelling, please consider subscribing. It allows us to keep digging into these uncomfortable but essential truths. Also, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The fourth step was forced motherhood. The relentless demand for these women was driven by a stark reality back in Scandinavia. Some historical and archaeological evidence points to the practice of selective female infanticide. In a harsh world where resources were scarce, a male child was a future warrior and farmer, while a female child required a dowry to marry off. The Roman historian Tacitus noted a similar practice among Germanic tribes centuries earlier. Later, Icelandic sagas contained passages that mentioned the practice of exposing unwanted infants, leaving them in the wilderness to die. While the evidence is debated, a society with even a small shortage of women creates immense social pressure. Viking men, particularly those without land or status, needed wives and concubines to establish a family, work their land, and produce heirs. Raiding for women was the brutal solution to this demographic problem. A captured woman was not just a laborer, she was a forced breeder. Her children were the key to the future of her master's farmstead. Any child born to a thrall woman and her master inherited the mother's status. The child was a slave. This created a self-perpetuating system of forced labor and sexual exploitation. A captured mother from Ireland or England could be forced to watch her own daughter, born into this new world of servitude, suffer the exact same fate she did. The child would grow up knowing nothing but bondage. raised to serve the master's legitimate children. This wasn't just random cruelty, it was a calculated economic strategy. It generated a new workforce at no cost, locking families into slavery for generations. The psychological toll is impossible to measure. To give birth in captivity, to know your child is legally property, to live with the constant fear that your son or daughter could be sold away from you at any moment. This was the reality. There were rare exceptions. A master might occasionally grant a thrall and her children freedom, a process called manumission. This sometimes happened if his legal wife failed to produce a male heir and his concubine did. By freeing the son, the master could make him his legal heir. But this was an act of self-interest, not compassion. It was entirely at the whim of the owner. For the overwhelming majority of enslaved mothers and their daughters, there was no escape. The cycle of servitude was absolute, passed down from one generation to the next. The fifth step was the genetic echo. The story of these tens of thousands of captured women isn't just in old books or broken bones. It's written into the DNA of entire nations. It is the evidence that cannot be argued away. A major genetic study of the Icelandic population, conducted by researchers at Decode Genetics in Reykjavik, delivered a shocking number. They analyzed mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down almost exclusively from mother to child, and the Y chromosome, which is passed from father to son. The results were stark. While most of the male settlers of Iceland were of Norse origin, around 80%, a staggering 62% of the original female settlers were from the British Isles, primarily Ireland and Scotland, 62%. Let that number sink in. It is not the signature of a peaceful migration of families. It is the undeniable genetic footprint of generations of raiding and a slave trade that systematically targeted mothers and daughters. The men were overwhelmingly Norse colonists. The women, in large part, were their captives. Iceland's founding mothers were, to a huge extent, enslaved women. This pattern repeats elsewhere. Studies of the populations in the Orkney and Shetland Islands, north of Scotland, show a similar story. The male lineage is dominated by Norse DNA, while the female lineage shows a much stronger connection to the original local population. The Viking men arrived, killed or drove off the local men, and took the local women for themselves. This genetic evidence reframes the entire story of the Viking expansion. It wasn't just about exploration or a search for new farmland. It was, for many, a violent, gendered conquest. The women who were taken were not just passive victims, they carried their culture with them. Some scholars suggest that elements of Gaelic language and storytelling found their way into Icelandic sagas and folklore through these captive mothers telling stories to their children. But their names are lost, their individual stories are gone. All that remains is the echo in the blood, a silent testament to the scale of their suffering and their survival. The DNA is the final, cold receipt of what happened to them. The end for some of these women was the most profane act of all, a final absolute demonstration of their status as property. The Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan, in his detailed report from the year 922, gives us an unflinching eyewitness account of the funeral of a Rus chieftain on the Volga River. When the chief died, his body was placed in a temporary grave for 10 days while his followers prepared for the funeral. They asked his slave girls a terrible question: "Who among you will die with him?" One girl volunteered. Ibn Fadlan writes that from that moment she was treated with a strange, ritualistic honor. She was given fine clothes and guarded by 2 other girls who attended to her every need. She spent her days drinking and singing. She was passed from tent to tent, where each of the dead chief's lieutenants had intercourse with her. As each man did so, he would say, "Tell your lord I have done this out of love for him." Was this a choice? In a life of absolute powerlessness, was this a desperate act to seize some form of meaning, or was she coerced by tradition and pressure? Ibn Fadlan notes that she was cheerful at first, but as the day of the cremation approached, she grew quiet and fearful. On the final day, they dragged the chief's ship ashore and built a platform of wood beneath it. They covered it with silks and Byzantine brocades. An old woman, whom they called the Angel of Death, oversaw the entire ritual. She was the one who would kill the girl. They placed the dead chieftain, dressed in his finest clothes, inside a pavilion on the ship. Around him they placed weapons, food, an intoxicating drink called nabid, and the bodies of sacrificed animals: 2 horses, 2 cows, a dog, and a rooster. Then the slave girl was brought to the ship. She took off her bracelets and gave them to the Angel of Death. She took off her anklets and gave them to the 2 girls who had served her. She was made to drink several cups of the strong nabid. She seemed dazed and tried to enter the pavilion, but was pushed inside by the old woman. The men began to bang their shields with sticks of wood. Ibn Fadlan asked his translator why. The reply was chilling: so that the other girls should not hear the noise of her cries and be frightened and seek to escape death with their masters. Inside the pavilion, several men lay down beside her. 2 took her feet, 2 her hands. The angel of death looped a silk cord with wooden handles around her neck and gave the ends to 2 men to pull. Then the old woman drew a broad-bladed dagger. As the men strangled the girl, the angel of death repeatedly plunged the dagger between her ribs. Her life was an object. Her death was a public spectacle. They laid her body next to her master's. Then the dead chief's closest male relative, naked, walked backwards towards the ship, holding a flaming torch, and set the entire structure on fire. The ship, the chief, his possessions, and the body of the girl he owned were consumed in a column of flame. It was the ultimate act of possession. Even in death, she did not belong to herself.